Okay, one of our traditions is that we start our meetings with a prayer or meditation. In a few minutes, I'll ask Tim to do that. So Tim will do the opening prayer or blessing. Then he will do a general welcome, after which he will introduce John Pielemeyer, who will introduce our speaker, and we will be off and running. Gary, welcome. It's good to see you. And I'll be standing on the side watching people and admitting people who show up later. Okay? So, Tim?
Yeah, thank you all for being here. The prayer this morning, I'm borrowing from a Jewish writer, Alden Solovey. He has a really interesting website. The website is entitled To Bend the Light, which I think is a beautiful idea to think about. This is a prayer for learning. This morning we talked about learning new ways to be church. Also talked about some of the difficulties in our world, the shootings, the police violence, and those things. So we're learning new ways to be citizens. And of course, Dr. Wasserman's book is about his experience learning and teaching. So I invite you to hear this prayer. God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God of our mothers, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel, open our hearts to serve others with joy and thanksgiving. Remove ego, judgment, and self-will so that we are present with kindness and understanding. Make us tools of your hand and echoes of your voice and shining lamps of your love. Grant us the wisdom to offer ourselves willingly without fear. Fill us with compassion and grace, vitality and endurance, so that our service becomes a blessing in heaven and on earth. Help us to learn the new things and the old things that seem new. Blessed are you, God of old and God of new. You set your people on a noble path to serve with love. Amen. So thank you, Maren, as always, for convening the Middle East Committee. Thanks particularly to those of you who are joining us. As I look at the Zoom squares, I see some names I don't recognize, people from around the country even. So we're glad to have you all here in this little corner of the world that is Westmoreland Congregational United Church of Christ via Zoom. And glad to have Gary Wasserman joining us. To introduce him is one of our Westmoreland members, John Pielemeyer. And I should also introduce John and Jim Burridge together, Georgetown classmates of Gary's as well. And it's fun to hear them talk about their experiences at Georgetown. But John is going to introduce Gary. John, of course, has done great work around the world, engaging people for justice and for good through our diplomatic efforts as a nation, and is a great Westmorelander. So John, thank you for your introductions and presence.
All right. Well, I'm glad to welcome Gary. And I'm glad to just do a brief introduction. Jim Burridge was going to do this, but he's not in the best of shape, but he's getting much better. Jim and I have known Gary since we were classmates together at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service in the previous century. We've known Gary, even then Gary was a writer. He was the editor of this school magazine, and also a very funny writer and columnist. He later started his own political satire magazine called Mole. And a mole, of course, is the political appointee who burrows in into the bureaucracy in the next administration, so he or she can keep their cushy jobs. And Gary ran that magazine for a while. He then went on, he's done a very serious work he's written the political science beginning science textbook, which has been republished now just recently for the 16th time.
Wow.
Imagine that.
I keep doing it till I get it right.
Yeah. Gary's also taught at a number of universities, including Johns Hopkins program in China and Columbia University, and of course, Qatar. he and I once worked together, only once, in, of all places, Zimbabwe. As a new country, we evaluated an AID program there. And we really enjoyed doing that. Gary's lovely wife, Ann, is a good friend as well. And they have 2 children and I believe 4 grandchildren. You can correct me on these things, Gary. The book provides stories of the challenges faced, especially by young Muslim women, often torn between their family traditions and the opportunities of the more modern world offered by Georgetown's campus, both in Qatar and some of them have come to Washington for periods of time here as well. The book really drops readers into the front lines of a clash of civilizations. And it's beautifully written and quite fun to read. And I'm glad Gary, at least one of our colleagues here has bought it and read it. So as well, aside from myself. So I'll turn this over to you and let you make your presentation. Then we'll have we'll hope to have questions from all of you. Gary?
Thanks, John. This is actually like teaching a class where only one person has read the book. But you're forgiven if you, agree to purchase it after the talk. Of course, after the talk, there's probably less reason to read it, but I'll let that one go. Let me start with a story. It occurred a few years after I was teaching in Doha, and I taught at Georgetown's Foreign Service School for 8 years. A woman, and actually we'd call them girls in Doha because any unmarried woman is called a girl. I, however, am the father of a daughter who at age 9 declared she would never be called a girl. So part of my unlearning and teaching in Doha was learning how to address women. This woman was a Qatari from a well-established family, and she came to my office to ask for a recommendation, which was not unusual. And I said, fine. She'd been a good student. I'm happy to give her a recommendation. She wanted to study in London. And we then proceeded to talk, and I said, well, basically, what do you want to study? And she then kind of meandered a bit, like I'm doing, but she was a student and she doesn't get away with that. And I said, it's going to be difficult to write a recommendation if I don't know what you want to study. Pause. Actually, I just want to get out of Doha because if I stay here, my family is going to force me to get married. And it's acceptable to them that I go to London for further studies. So I would like to do that. I wrote the recommendation. It was a kind of an example of, if you like, a consequence that Georgetown probably didn't foresee when they brought a branch of the Foreign Service School to Doha. That in fact, a woman would be using the leverage of a liberal education to undermine that traditional society she was coming to carve out some autonomy for herself and to kind of come to a different kind of life choices in her own education and her own living arrangements. Whether in fact it would make any long-term difference in how she lived and the profession she pursued, or whether it was just kind of delaying the inevitable reintegration into her family and the traditions of that family. And it was a reminder of the kind of unforeseen consequences of teaching, if you like, or presenting a liberal education in a traditional society. It was also a couple things come out of the story, if you think about it for a minute, which is that her family wanted her to be educated. They were not standing in the way of a woman's education. In fact, they saw that as an enhancement of the family. They didn't see that as, I think most, shall we say, younger people and ourselves in American or European societies as a pursuit of individual gain. They saw that as something that was good for the family, that would, whether it was in bragging rights or helping her make a better marriage or having her do the kind of work she wanted to do. Education was not seen as undermining traditional society. It was seen as enhancing the family as well as the daughter getting that education. But there clearly was a rub. There clearly was some conflict there. Now, one of the things I'm reminded of when I talk about my experience teaching abroad and predominantly Arab classes is there's always a temptation to make that experience more exotic than it is. If you had come to one of my classes in Doha, in fact, you'd recognize immediately what was going on. There'd be the sage on the stage dispensing wisdom to the sometimes interested students in a class of 25. A third of them would probably be in robes, the thobe for the white thobe for the men, the black abaya for the women, and they would be Qataris. A third of them would be from anywhere from Bosnia to Bangladesh, mostly Muslim, from the Muslim world. And then a third would be kind of undefinable. They might be from expat families in Doha. They might be from some European countries, et cetera. They'd be scattered. And they would generally look like students with the same degree of smartness or not so smart, interest and not so interested in what was going on in the class. And I would be teaching either American politics, international relations, media, political parties, et cetera. Now, the other thing you'd probably notice in a classroom, and this was generally true of Georgetown's Foreign Service School, 70% of the students would be women. One of the motivations that we found out as I got there, in establishing Education City, which Georgetown joined, which was when we arrived, was 6 American universities teaching everything from engineering at Texas A&M to pre-med at Weill Cornell to Carnegie Mellon's computer and business to Northwestern, which would later join in teaching journalism, is that this was kind of home delivered education. And in fact, one of the goals in providing this education in Doha was to kind of avoid Western education overseas. It was the dream held by many American parents as well, that you could somehow separate the good parts of a college education, learning, learning about the world, providing the wherewithal for a profession, growing up, from the bad parts of higher education, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. As I said, it's a dream shared by many parents in this country. It just can't be afforded quite as easily as it was in Qatar. So the Qataris saw Georgetown and these other universities as a place to educate their youth, especially their women, and not have them exposed, if you like, to what Western education, they thought of as Western education outside of the country. I should add that one of the fears of going to school in America was not so much that they would fall in love with non-Muslim spouses or potential spouses, but that in fact it was a dangerous place to be. And of course, not altogether distorted by media, but certainly highlighted by media, was the dangers that many foreigners saw in American society. And they certainly didn't want their children exposed to that, as opposed to what was a very safe country of Doha. Now, again, when talking about the students, these women were certainly tied to their traditions and family. It was a commuter school. Most lived at home and would leave campus at the end of the day. Extracurricular activities were generally not as indulged in. The students indulged in it, the parents not so much. So you wouldn't, it was seldom other than at graduation that you ended up meeting parents. And I remember at one, we had I don't even remember what it was, but some kind of a banquet. And I was seated next to a distinguished Qatari man. And I asked him, why don't more parents show up to these affairs? And he looked at me and he said, why would I want to eat with strangers when I can have dinner with my family at home? A fair question, I'd say. But then again, we do gather together even around Zoom and kind of meet with strangers. So it was a different attitude towards education. And in many ways, the attitude towards education from the Qataris was a bit of a mix. They certainly didn't see themselves as buying into liberal education. They weren't there to transform their children or their families. They were there, they did have a sense that they were preparing their children for a world they didn't understand, and that was changing. And that was kind of the most progressive way they looked at it. But they also saw themselves as preserving the world they were coming from. They saw education as a means of, if you like, preserving their affluence, preserving their privileges, and preserving a country that at some point, the natural gas on which their wealth depended would run out. And that was certainly the perspective of the leaders in Qatar. The Emir and the Sheikha, his second wife, who really led the negotiations that brought Georgetown to Doha, saw this as when they spoke to some of the administrators at Georgetown, they spoke about Spanish gold and how when the gold in the New World ran out, Spain as a great power declined. And they saw the analogy to the Middle East, and I think this might be expanded to other Middle Eastern oil-rich countries. And they wanted their people to be ready for an age when they could no longer depend on the extractive wealth that they currently depended on. And so education was a way of converting, if you like, that fossil fuel affluence into something that might prove more lasting. And so again, this was part of the motivation, if you like, for the education they're acquiring. There were other themes going on that you could puzzle out in their attitudes towards education. Their lack of interest in the process, for instance, reflected that in many ways, education, higher education, was art on the wall. So just like they bought the best art in the world and displayed it in their museums, so they wanted to buy the best education in the world. So that could be displayed on their walls or in their children. And in many ways, education was seen as a commodity, and you could buy into it and you could buy the best. And American higher education was and is the gold standard in the world. If you want the best, you go to American universities. Whether that's true or not, the reputation is there. And it certainly enhances America's ability in that area of the world to have what's political scientists call soft power, the building of networks of allies, the building of shared outlooks, and the kind of ties that exist between students and faculty and others engaging in this higher education. So if you like, let's see, I wanted to say a little bit about the idea of liberal education. Keep in mind that when the Qatari leadership looked at education, they kind of divided it into categories, and you could see that. You want doctors, you get a medical school. You want engineers, you get Texas A&M. You want fashion designers, you get Virginia Commonwealth. And you want administrators, you get Georgetown. Now, one of the things Georgetown's administrators, in fairness to them, tried to explain to them is, you understand this is liberal education. You understand that it's not just a kind of transference of technical skills that's going on. We are educating the whole man, or the whole person in this case. And that we want to kind of imbue on them a sense, both in process and substance, of something called a liberal education. Now, my colleagues would say, well, we're teaching our students to think. We're teaching them how to think, how to do research, how to investigate data, how to put together an argument. But of course, that doesn't quite do justice to everything that liberal education means. There is certainly a substantive side to that. We were not going there to train people to be racist, to train people to reinforce misogyny, to if you like, enhance a narrow view of the world. There was real substance, if you like, and substantive conclusions we wanted to reach to with our students. And so the idea that somehow you were just teaching a process was a little bit not quite the whole truth. We were also teaching them to, if you like, co-ed education, which was most of them had not experienced before college, was a reinforcement of the role of women. We certainly honored the idea that minorities and political dissenters and other religions should be respected, and something more than tolerance should be displayed of people who are not the same as we are. And clearly, in a way, women were enhanced in their ability to make choices on their own about the kind of life they'd live, the professions they would follow, and who they would choose as a mate. And the question, of course, that we went back and forth on is there a place for these graduates in the societies that are sending them here? Will they be able to go back and have this education be integrated into the societies that they came from? That question I'll hurriedly answer as not yet known. In many ways, we were training, I think many of us concluded, we were training an elite that would fit more easily into a globalized world outside of Qatar, that they would end up in New York and London and Paris and take positions in international corporations and nonprofits and international organizations much more easily than they could fitting back into Doha. Now that, of course, assumes that their education was prevailed, if you like, that they not only talked the talk of liberalism, but that they walked the walk. In many ways, I think many of them kind of reintegrated back into the traditional lives, married the men that their parents at least would agree to them marrying, and settled down to a very pleasant, affluent lifestyle in Doha. So it wasn't quite clear what would happen in these circumstances. Now there's a bit of a muddle there because you're clearly educating an elite and you're clearly enhancing their privileges. And so at the same time, and I used to do this in my classes, I'd point out my window to the ever-present migrants from Southern Asia usually, who were building something or other. There was always construction going on in Doha, and whether it was highways or buildings, and now they're getting ready for the hosting the World Soccer Tournament next year. So there's always construction going on. And I would say something like, there's no greater privilege in life than for us to be here discussing ideas while others are outside digging ditches. And the students would, of course, nod and kind of tolerate this burst of guilt and liberalism while going back to their privileges. But nonetheless, you were trying to kind of remind them of the privileges they enjoyed, while of course enhancing those privileges by the education you were offering them. Let me open this up to questions, but say something else about kind of what did you learn from this experience, if you like. And it's, you know, like most of the kind of lessons we learn, at least by the time we've reached my age, they're pretty simple. And they're kind of, you know, simple in the sense of, you say, you mean you didn't know that? And the answer is, of course, I didn't. And the answer is that when we started this process, I was very concerned about what I was doing there. You know, an American teaching Arabs, a Jewish professor teaching Muslims, a guy of a certain age teaching these younger upcoming elites. And one of the things that comes out of this contrast of which I had to sell to my family only over time, was it wasn't just a question of Americans teaching Arabs or Americans confronting Arabs. You find when you start meeting people and talking to people and getting to know people that we're all, in fact, multiple identities, that we're not these one things that we kind of use to kind of categorize and if you like, simplify people and deal with them on those kind of easily understood basis. And that in fact, with my students, I could share a like for certain political views. I could share with them a concern for climate change, for things that we shared in the world, a dislike for injustice, a love for certain music, for certain art, for certain works of literature. And so you find that there's all kinds of overlaps with people that you share and that you can kind of hold in common. And so when you get to know people, you find that those categories that once drove you apart or that you thought made a big difference were much smaller in their impact. And that there was in fact much to be shared and much to be learned from. And I think one of the problems we have in importing the education that we hold in some esteem is that we're not really allowing that kind of cross-cultural transformation to take place. We didn't really go there to learn much from the Qataris. Georgetown didn't really want to integrate its curriculum or even its faculty into the Arab world. We were there to kind of deliver the goods. And in that way, we kind of resembled the old gold, God, and glory of a previous imperialist age. And I'm not saying we all shared that view. I mean, there's obviously many different people, many different views in the Georgetown hierarchy. And I think Georgetown, because I was critical in many ways in my book of them, should be congratulated on the courage they showed 5 years after and less after 9/11 to bring their university out to the Middle East. It wasn't a sure thing at all that it would work. It's still not a sure thing that it would work. It also wasn't full of the abundant riches some people outside think that Georgetown's making from it. And certainly they didn't give up on their Catholic heritage. One of the things the Sheikha said to one of the negotiators, which may show what an adept negotiator she was, is that when she was confronted with the idea that Georgetown was a Catholic university and had no desire to give up that identity or that heritage, she said, well, I hope that we as Muslims can learn how you can do a Catholic university and hold on to your religious beliefs while allowing a diversity of opinion, while allowing a liberal education to flourish within your walls. And so she said, we want you to keep that religious background, and we want to see what we can learn in establishing our own institutions that could promote higher education. So I think there was this kind of cross-fertilization occurring. I think there are also many walls that kind of protect either side. There's also, in a realpolitik world of calculation of interests, it's very difficult to get this sort of thing established. I note that not many have been established since then, and it's a difficult time in the world to do that. But I think Georgetown and the other universities there, and as well as Qatar, offer some models for how this might be repeated elsewhere in the world. So thank you very much. I'll hold myself open to questions.
If you have a question, you can just wave your hand in the view, or you can use the participant raising hand option. Jim Shear, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Well, thanks to Professor Wasserman and for interesting, very interesting history of Georgetown's engagement in the Gulf, in Qatar. I'll say up front, I am married to a faculty member at Georgetown, but I actually went to undergraduate at the American University School of International Service. So I guess I'll refer to Georgetown as a frenemy. But I greatly appreciate your experiences there. My question has to do with who was actually digging the gutters. As you know, there's a very large diaspora community throughout the Gulf. And as somebody who's focused on Africa and other parts of South and Southeast Asia, I'm just curious as to the extent of contact you and faculty had in that particular domain of Qatar, which I think was very significant. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. I do devote a chapter in my book to the immigrant community, and I actually call it the migrant majority because of the 3 million odd people in Qatar, only about 300,000 are Qataris. And the rest, the majority of the rest, are from Southern Asia, India, Nepal, Philippines, Bangladesh, Pakistan. And they, of course, man the construction and servants and kind of medical staff that kind of keeps the place going. The original migrant community was taken mostly from the rest of the Arab world. And that changed over time, both because they needed more people and because they felt that the Southern Asians would be a little bit more pliable in their working conditions. There's no unions, they're not considered citizens. They are treated as, second-class citizens. They live in dormitories. Georgetown, passports taken away. Passports are often taken away. I think Western liberals tend to go there and view with some astonishment the treatment in what is the wealthiest per capita country in the world, treatment of these migrants. Having said that, the migrants themselves don't consider their position as bad as sometimes we look at it. They're coming, we got to know quite a few of them, and they're coming from, that reflects the societies they're coming from. Our Nepalese gardener who worked in our compound, for instance, couldn't get a job in Nepal. And Nepal, of course, beyond the earthquakes and the civil wars and the stress, was falling apart most of the time. He thought he had won the lottery. He was able to educate his children. He was able to build a house for his family. He would go back every 3 years and see them. They were, the worst part of it, of course, was the separation from family. Families weren't allowed to come with them, and you ended up with this kind of male population on their own. But he was sacrificing himself for his next generation. He was sacrificing himself for his family. And in that sense, he thought he was doing fine. And of course, the Qataris didn't exactly welcome criticisms of their treatment. I should add that Georgetown kind of tried to finesse this as much as possible so that the migrants who serviced the buildings, cleaned it and took on the janitorial tasks, were employed by the Qatar Foundation. So Georgetown had a certain arm's length relationship there that they could try to influence, et cetera. Now, having said that, what you would expect happened at a university. There were English classes for the migrants. My wife, for instance, and a lot of the spouses would teach the migrants English, would teach the women language, would in fact, there was programs, food drives, et cetera, that kind of provided a kind of liberal, if you like, icing on the situation. There were efforts made while we were there to improve the situation, the living conditions, giving them some rights vis-a-vis their bosses in terms of their ability to take their passports away and fire them at will. And there had been efforts made to improve the situation. I would not overstate that. And one of the things I said at the end of the chapter was about Georgetown's kind of coming to terms with slave labor building the Georgetown campus in Washington some 150 years afterwards. And I was hoping that Georgetown wouldn't take quite so long to come to terms with dealing with the migrant labor in Qatar.
Okay, Nadja, unmute. Nadja Druby, your
Yes,
question, please.
Can you hear me? You can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Okay. I had a question regarding the cross-cultural pollination, or whatever you want to call it. First, in terms of, actually several questions. In terms of the degree, a Georgetown degree from Qatar is considered here in America the equivalent of a Georgetown degree from here. So would these kids be able to work here or be sought after here in the States as much as they would be as anyone who graduated from here? This was one. The second one is, was the curriculum exactly like the one that is here? So for you to have to graduate, you have so many prerequisites and whatever. Were these adapted to the Arab world? So instead of English studies, Arabic studies, or whatever. What was changed, or was it just transplanted over there? And here we're giving you the best education in the world, and you should be thankful for it.
Right. Thanks, Nadja. On the curriculum, yes. I mean, one of the insistence made by the Qataris is they wanted the same curriculum. They wanted the same education that was given in Washington to be given in Doha. And that became a one of the things that was insisted on. I do discuss some of the problems. For instance, they teach a class called Problems of God, which was a very popular class. And that was, again, it was adapted in some ways, but it was clearly open to a kind of multi-religious approach. The courses themselves were given exactly as here. I should add that the students taking it, while the admission standards were somewhat not as restrictive as Washington. So in Washington, you were admitting about 17% of the applicants. In Qatar, you were admitting probably 40%, 45% of the applicants. So it wasn't as hard to get in. There was also a certain amount of, for want of a better phrase, affirmative action towards admitting Qataris. But the curriculum was the same. And I think the quality of the instruction was the same. And Georgetown was very kind of strict about that. When you said about the degree, it's funny that one of the most frequently asked questions of students who are being admitted or trying to gain admission was, what will my diploma say? And will it be the same as in Washington? Well, it was the same as the one granted in Washington, but of course it was in Latin. And so I remember my students asking me, what does that mean? Professor Wasserman, you know all things. And I said, well, the rough translation is Jesus hates losers. And that seemed to satisfy them for a while.
Okay, we have a question from the chat. First, now, does that answer your questions? Okay, we have a question from the chat from Karen Heckman, who is one of the readers of the book. She asks, did you ever hear back from the young woman who wanted to go to London? What did she finally do? What did she study? Did she return and marry and give it all up?
You know, I lost contact with her. She did end up going to London. She did end up getting her graduate degree. And then, you know, I did not keep up with it. I mean, one of the problems of leaving there, and of course being a former teacher, is you kind of lose contact. I should say that, you know, my book was greeted with rather mixed results, and I was a little disappointed in the reaction. There was not, how do I say this? Faculty, you know, faculty who spend their lives critiquing the rest of the institutions of the world hate to see themselves in print. And I think there's a rather kind of a sense of that you really shouldn't be discussing all these matters. And I think the Qataris themselves, and the book is not available in Qatar. And that is kind of consistent with Qatari practice. I know one of my colleagues, Marian Kamrava, published a book on Qatari politics, which got very good reviews, not available in Qatar. So you don't want to be discussing things that are considered family matters. And in some ways, it's kind of like family in the Qatar side of things. As for the institution side of things, there's a sense of, and I didn't use my students' names in the writing. I changed their names because I didn't think it was fair to kind of expose students to what they had said in class, or had them responsible for things that they didn't necessarily want to be in that curious position of a classroom, which is not quite public and not quite private. So there was a certain falling away in terms of kind of follow through or follow up in the reaction to the book.
Are there any other questions? Wave your hand or.
Yeah, I have a question. I have a question, Gary.
Okay.
For a while, I was an adjunct professor at Georgetown, and when I was going to my evening class to teach it, I would find in the bottom floor of the Cultural International Center, classes full of young Arab women and men here in Washington. Do you have any idea where those people coming from? Places like Qatar? Are they from other locations? And do you have a sense of what the Arab population that Georgetown is looking for in terms of an education here?
Yeah, I don't, but certainly that was encouraged from the Doha side. You know, Doha is a pretty small place and a very parochial place. And one of the things I thought they could encourage more was the idea of junior year abroad, and that was often done as a kind of summer program abroad. You could improve your English, you could take classes you didn't expect, you couldn't take on the Doha campus, et cetera. So there was some encouragement of that. It's the usual, there was a little tension there because you wanted to keep as many students in Doha as you could to fill up your classes. One interesting story, when we talk about the impact you had, was a student I had in my international relations class. And, you know, I should add that I received a great deal of, well, how do I say this? That I never received any harassment or disrespect on people when they found out I was Jewish. People couldn't have been more polite, more, if you like, understanding, whatever you want to say about it. It certainly wasn't what I expected. nonetheless, there was always a little bit of tension here and there. And I had this student in my international relations class who, we'd be talking about a Cuban boycott, and he would bring up the Israeli lobby in Washington. We would talk about the causes of World War I, and he might bring up the Rothschilds and, whatever he thought Jews might be doing at the time. You get the praise. It was never direct, but at some point I had him come to my office and I said, listen, do we have an issue here? I mean, what's going on here? Well, he denied everything. Said, no, nothing to do with anything, not there. I, in fact, appreciate your class. And I did, in fact, give a class on the American-Israeli lobby at one point in the course. Anyway, a few years later, he stopped by my office and I hadn't seen him for a while. And he said, I went to Georgetown for a semester and I took a class in the history of Jewish civilization. And he said, I never would have taken that class without having been in your class. And I learned a lot. Well, what more can a teacher hope for? So.
Right. Alton Fry, unmute and ask your question, please.
It follows the kind of multicultural reference you were just discussing, Professor Wasserman. As a Protestant graduate of another Jesuit university, St. Louis, I have often reflected on the evolution of the Jesuit communities toward lay leadership in their universities. In the special circumstance where you were teaching, you've already mentioned that some things remain sort of off limits. Your book's not available there. Some other things that you mentioned are not available in Qatar. My question is very simple. Symbolically, were there priests, Jesuit or otherwise, teaching as a part of the Georgetown program, and how were they received if they were there?
There was always one Jesuit on the faculty. One of the things they had, one of the negotiating positions was that they wanted to bring a religious counselor into the administration of the branch. And the Qataris objected to that. But as usual in these kind of things, and you've dealt with that in your own career, they ended up getting a priest on the faculty, and he would teach problems of God sometimes, he'd teach other things, and they'd have a mass and every Sunday and smuggle in the wine. So as long as, like many things in that part of the world, as long as you didn't say it, and as long as you didn't label it, it was acceptable. And so in fact, the priests, series of were perfectly acceptable, etc. And in some ways, of course, we're these religions, Jewish, Christianity, and Muslim, were all considered people of the book, and certainly to be put in higher esteem than the multi-deities in the Hindu religion. So there was a certain acceptance of these co-religionists and what they were doing. And they had, at some point, there was a church that was allowed, that was kind of multi-Christian denominations in Doha. Qatar, one of my colleagues, actually a former ambassador there, had described Qatar as being the kind of Athens opposed to the Sparta of Saudi Arabia. So it was a coastal culture. It was used to different cultures and mixing and openness towards the outside world, where Saudi Arabia was a land-based power and much more enclosed, much more fundamentalist in their religious beliefs. Somebody described Qatar as Wahhabi light. There was a certain, kind of, women were driving, women were serving in government. There was a much more of a kind of a relaxed attitude towards a lot of lifestyle practices in Qatar. And I think in general, people were more open to the outside world. If that answers that question. And certainly priests were there. There were no crucifixes in the front of the classrooms. And at one point in negotiation, some Jesuit asked, where is the Jesuit graveyard going to be? Which of course, is, anybody knows Georgetown campus is behind Healy. Well, that question never had to be answered because it was never asked.
I have one more question, Gary. You were there, I believe, during part of the Arab Spring. We've just seen recently some that even countries with kings and kingdoms like Jordan may have family problems and problems that may make the long-term stability of that kingdom uncertain. Did you find, what was the reaction in Qatar to the Arab Spring?
You know, there was a mixture. I mean, on one hand, it was the home of Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera was clearly reflecting a very progressive, at least in foreign policy, attitude towards the ruling group in Doha, which had supported progressive movements throughout the Arab world and very much encouraging some of these movements going on in Libya, in Egypt, et cetera. And of course, one of the reasons that Qatar ran into trouble with the boycott was that they were considered instigators of a lot of these liberal and progressive movements in the rest of the world. And the royal family, I heard from private conversations, had a very dour outlook towards some of the autocrats ruling in the Arab world. They saw them as thugs. They saw them as intolerant. They saw them as holding back the greatness of the Arab people. Having said that, when I said in the beginning of my talk about I wouldn't overstate the differences with the students, one of the differences you notice in the students I taught was their respect for authority. Authority was something to be valued. And in many ways, people in Qatar would look at what was going on in the Arab Spring and say, well, I'm glad we have stability here. I'm glad we have security in Qatar. We have a royal family. We're doing well. We don't want to endanger our own stability and our own affluence. And my students, a number of whom, some from Lebanon, some from Iraq, some from Jordan, had experience with war. They knew what bloodshed was like. They knew what instability cost their families. And so they had a deep kind of respect for, if you like, stability, which I don't always find on campuses in our country, where I don't think we've experienced that kind of instability. But my students had, and they were very wary of change that might, if you like, undermine the stability that generally existed in the Gulf countries. And they saw themselves as benefiting from this kind of unearned affluence from their oil riches, and they really didn't want to disrupt that. So while they might cheer from a distance for students in Cairo and hope that the Muslim Brotherhood could stabilize, they also were very wary of those kind of insurrections. There was a certain kind of reluctance to be much more than a kind of rhetorical radical in some of those instances.
I have
Just a quick follow-up. It's very interesting there. The interest in stability was also, I think, conveyed to the diaspora in the Gulf. I still recall when the ICU, the Islamic Courts Union, was driving down to Mogadishu in 2007. They became Al-Shabaab later. They threatened to turn Mogadishu into a modern-day Baghdad. And a lot of Somalis in the Gulf wrote back and said, our remittances are going to go away and any foreign investments in Mogadishu are going to go away. Do not invade and sack Mogadishu, and the ICU actually heard that and they moved south. So Mogadishu is alive today in part because, and it's still not out of the woods, but it's in part due to the fact that the diaspora in the Gulf really weighed in very heavily in favor of stability. Over.
Good point.
I have a question, Gary, about the program now. How many of those universities are still participating in this education program in Qatar? Are they still there?
Yeah, they're all still there, as I understand it. In fact, they've enhanced it a little bit with an Islamic studies program. 2015, there was a general cutback. A new emir came in, and there was a general a move. Two things happened. The society itself became generally more conservative. So, for instance, Qatar University was kind of like a sister local campus, started teaching in Arabic rather than in English. And there was a general movement afoot to kind of reinforce kind of traditional norms. At the same time, the university's budget in Education City was cut. And this was also a combination of both the society itself getting a little bit more traditional and conservative for various reasons, and the revenues coming in from gas and to a lesser extent oil being reduced. So they felt they had to get a little less spendthrift. Having said that, they then went ahead and are spending, as I understand, $100 billion, making themselves welcome to this soccer, the World Cup in Doha next year. So there was this combination of, I mean, there were things spent on there that were just, I didn't know what the hell that was about, you know, from ever metastasizing malls to highways to they're putting in a subway now. And it's just, you know, you kind of look at it and say, couldn't you do something better with this money? On the other hand, it's not my money and I'm not making those decisions.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Well, in that case, I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you very much, Gary. I appreciate it, and I think everybody else does. I feel like I gained new perspectives, as I always do when we hear from our speakers. We opened the meeting with our traditional blessing and prayer. Another one of our traditions is giving a bottle of Palestinian olive oil to our speakers. I'm sorry, Gary, you're too far away. However, as a special thank you to Jim Burridge and as a part of our Get Well wish, Terry, Leon, and I will deliver a bottle of olive oil to Arlington sometime this week to thank Jim and to wish him the best as he recovers.
Exactly what I would have
We'll put it to
suggested.
good use.
Thank you.
Well,
Jenny.
good. I look forward to buying your book, and we'll add it. It'll be number 2, I guess, in my reading list because I've got a couple of things on the nightstand. Our May program is undecided right now, but I think I can give you a hint. There is a very popular movie called Mayor, which is the story of the mayor of Ramallah. And another group is planning a discussion of that on May 16th. So it's very likely that in lieu of our after worship meeting, we will join that discussion of the movie Mayor, and I'll be publicizing how you'll be able to get access to that movie without any cost as time goes on. So thanks again, Gary. Thanks to all of you for your attention and your thoughtful questions. It's a pleasure to work with all of you.
Thank you, Jim. Get better soon.
Okay,
Amen.
goodbye.